Greetings, fellow insomniacs and connoisseurs of historical suffering. Tonight we delve into the Siege of Antioch. Forget valiant charges, this was mass starvation, dodgy leadership, and a very convenient spear. Being a knight here, it truly hilariously sucked. You wouldn't wish this on your worst enemy, unless they were a Saracen, of course. If this dark humor tickles your funny bone, do the noble thing, like and subscribe. It helps unearth more delightfully dreadful tales. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it? Let's connect now. Dim lights and ease into tonight's miserable history. So picture this. It's the tail end of the 11th century, a fervent, volatile era. Pope Urban II has lit an unprecedented fire under Western Europe, and the First Crusade is on. Thousands of knights, peasants, and clergy are marching east. Their ultimate destination? Jerusalem, the Holy City. It's a grand, divinely sanctioned road trip with a very pointy objective. Spirits initially were probably sky high. They were on God's errand after all. What could go wrong on a mission from the Almighty? This was meant to be an epic saga of faith, valor, and a swift, righteous victory for Christendom. But before Jerusalem, there was Antioch, a massive, inconveniently placed stepping stone. This wasn't just any dusty outpost. Antioch was a legend, an ancient metropolis, cradle of early Christianity, now a formidable Muslim stronghold. Think of it as the heavily fortified VIP lounge on the highway to the Holy Land. It was the gateway to Syria, controlling vital routes and access south. Taking Antioch wasn't just desirable, it was strategically essential for the Crusade's success, a non-negotiable part of the plan, a glittering prize crucial for momentum and morale, or so it seemed from afar. Its capture would send a powerful signal indeed. For many a knight who'd mortgaged lands and kissed family goodbye, Antioch was the moment. A chance to prove piety, martial prowess, and maybe carve out a rich fiefdom. The air was thick with talk of holy purpose and righteous conquest. They probably envisioned heroic charges, banners waving, good Christian steel clanging, followed by a swift, glorious victory. After all, they were God's army, blessed and ready. This was their time to shine, a pivotal chapter in their own chivalric romance, a story of heroism against these odds. Glory and divine favor awaited them surely. And then they arrived at Antioch in October 1097, a vast army staring at its imposing walls. This is where the imagined Crusade's soaring score meets reality's harsh, discordant screech. Taking this city, not a dashing affair of a few well-aimed shots. Oh, no siree. The Siege of Antioch would, in hindsight, become less a textbook of military strategy and more an excruciating instruction manual on how not to conduct a medieval siege if you value your sanity, supplies, and bowels. The sheer scale of the defenses was an immediate, sobering shock. Part of the problem, a source of future agony, was the leadership, or the gaggle of ambitious, squabbling nobles vying for prominence. Imagine a critical group project where everyone wants to be bossed, nobody brought notes, and half the team secretly hates the other half. Now, make that project a life-or-death siege against a well-defended city, miles from home, with supplies dwindling fast. It was a recipe not for success, but for pure unadulterated suckage for the average knight, caught between enemy walls in their own tragically chaotic command. The word siege implies active engagement, but for long stretches, Antioch was less a dynamic operation and more a grim, static waiting game, a miserable, soul-crushing stalemate. The Crusaders had the city surrounded, mostly, but Antioch's defenses were truly formidable. Its massive, ancient walls, studded with hundreds of towers, laughed at their initial, often uncoordinated efforts. So, it became a brutal contest of wills and resources, a slow, grinding attrition. Who would break first? The besieged, running out of food within their stone cage, or the besiegers slowly starving and freezing outside it? And this, dear viewers, is where Suck to be a Knight really gathers steam, morphing from mere inconvenience into an art form of profound suffering. We're talking impending misery so profound, so multifaceted, it's almost darkly comedic from our comfy 21st century view. Forget glorious last stands for a moment. We're about to witness the medieval misery Olympics, and our knights are the unwilling star athletes in every single agonizing event. Every cherished expectation of a swift, holy triumph was about to be systematically ground into dust, quite literally, under Antioch's impassive gaze. So to recap, the grand vision was clear: march to Jerusalem, reclaim sacred sites, bask in divine glory. Antioch was a crucial, glittering checkpoint on this righteous path, but the grimy, unglamorous reality that slapped them in the face outside those massive walls was something else entirely. A brutal, ice-cold awakening. This wasn't the crusade from the stirring sermons back home. This was where heroic ideals died a slow, agonizing death from hunger, disease, infighting, and the dawning horror that perhaps God had left them on read. The true definition of suck, the real test of endurance against mounting despair, was just beginning for every single knight. Alright, so we've established that being a knight at the Siege of Antioch was a masterclass in misery. But to truly appreciate the depths of suckage awaiting them there, we need to rewind. The suffering didn't just magically begin when they clapped eyes on Antioch's mighty walls. Oh no. The journey to Antioch was its own special kind of hell, a relentless appetizer of agony that had already broken lesser men. Think of it as the warm-up act for the main event of torment, a long, grueling preview of the pain that was to become their daily bread, when they could find any, that is. It all began with such fervor, didn't it? Pope Urban II's call in 1095 echoed across Europe, and thousands, from the highest duke to the humblest peasant, answered. God wills it, they cried, strapping on swords and abandoning their plows. The initial wave, often called the People's Crusade, was less a disciplined army and more an over-enthusiastic, undersupplied mob. Led by charismatic figures like Peter the Hermit, they surged eastwards, a torrent of piety and naivety. Their fate? A swift and brutal annihilation in Anatolia, a grim foreshadowing, if anyone was paying attention, of what happens when zeal outstrips preparation. Then came the Prince's Crusade, the main event, supposedly more organized, better equipped, and led by some of the most powerful nobles in Christendom, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, big names with big armies. They took different routes, converging on Constantinople, the shimmering capital of the Byzantine Empire. But even this more professional endeavor was a logistical beast of unimaginable complexity. Moving tens of thousands of soldiers plus horses, pack animals, and a horde of non-combatant pilgrims and hangers-on across the continent was an invitation for disaster before they even faced a single enemy. The first cracks in their shiny armor of optimism appeared early. Marching through Eastern Europe and Byzantine lands, which were notionally Christian allies, wasn't always a welcoming picnic. Supplies were often scarce or grudgingly given. Locals, wary of these massive armed bands passing through, weren't always cooperative. There were skirmishes, misunderstandings, and the gnawing realization that this holy journey was going to involve a lot of distinctly unholy scrounging simply to survive, even before they reached truly hostile territory. The gloss was already starting to wear thin. Once they crossed the Bosporus into Asia Minor, into lands controlled by the Seljuk Turks, the training wheels came off entirely. Anatolia in the 11th century was not a welcoming place for a Christian army. It was a vast, often arid and fiercely contested landscape. The initial march after leaving Nicaea, their first major conquest, was deceptively swift, but the terrain soon became their enemy as much as the Turks. A scorching summer heat by day, chilling nights, rugged mountains and desolate plains stretched before them, a seemingly endless expanse of hardship. Then came the Battle of Dorylaeum in July 1097. The Crusaders, marching in separate columns, were ambushed by the numerically superior forces of Kilij Arslan I. Bohemond's contingent, found itself surrounded, fighting desperately for hours against a hail of arrows. It was a near-run thing, a terrifying glimpse of annihilation. Only the timely arrival of Godfrey's and Raymond's forces turned a potential catastrophe into a hard-won, bloody victory. They had prevailed, yes, but the cost was steep, and the psychological shock of nearly being wiped out so early in their Anatolian trek lingered heavily. That victory opened the way, but the march that followed Dorylaeum became legendary for its brutality. Imagine trudging for weeks under a relentless sun, through a depopulated land where retreating Turks had often poisoned wells and destroyed crops. Water became an obsession, more precious than gold. Food supplies, already strained, dwindled to almost nothing. Men and beasts alike began to drop from heatstroke, dehydration, and sheer exhaustion. The glorious crusade was rapidly devolving into a desperate scramble for basic survival, a far cry from the chivalric ideals they'd set out with. Disease, the silent killer of medieval armies, began its grim work. With thousands packed together, sanitation was non-existent. Dysentery, typhoid, fevers, they spread like wildfire through the camps. Knights, once proud and strong in their mail, were reduced to weakened, shivering husks, barely able to sit their horses, let alone fight. Every day more graves were dug, more prayers muttered for souls departed, not in glorious battle, but in some squalid, fly-blown camp. The stench of sickness and death became a constant companion on the road. Starvation, a word that would become intimately familiar at Antioch, made its horrifying debut during this Anatolian crossing. Foraging parties returned with less and less. Knights were reportedly reduced to eating their own war horses, a terrible sacrifice for a mounted warrior. There were dark whispers of even worse things, of men driven to the absolute extremes of desperation by the relentless pangs of hunger. The chronicles speak of a land of death, where the living envied the dead their peace. Every league gained was paid for in suffering. The psychological toll was immense. The constant fear of ambush, the sight of comrades dying miserably, the gnawing hunger and thirst, the sheer unending monotony of the march, it all ground down their morale. The initial religious fervor began to wane for some, replaced by a grim, dogged determination, or worse, by despair. This wasn't the glorious pilgrimage they had envisioned. This was a charnel house on the move, a testament to human endurance pushed to its absolute breaking point and often beyond. Unsurprisingly, desertions began to sap their strength further. Not everyone could endure such relentless hardship. Some, seeing the mounting toll and the seemingly endless journey ahead, simply lost heart. They slipped away under cover of darkness, hoping to make their way back home or perhaps to some less accursed part of the world. Each deserter was not just one less sword, but also a blow to the morale of those who remained, a silent acknowledgement of the misery they were all enduring. The once mighty host that had left Europe, swelled with such confidence and divine purpose, was now a noticeably thinner, more ragged column. Thousands had already perished to battle, yes, but far more to disease, starvation, and exposure. Their fine banners were tattered, their armor dented and rusty, their horses gaunt and few. They were a spectral army, fueled by a grim cocktail of faith, desperation, and the sheer inability to turn back. They had come too far to give up, but the cost was etched on every face. When they finally staggered out of the Anatolian highlands and into northern Syria, approaching the region of Antioch in October 1097, the sense of relief must have been immense. They had survived the march from hell. They had overcome deserts, mountains, and fierce Turkish resistance. They had made it. But they were a shadow of their former selves, an army already half crippled, deeply scarred by the horrors they had endured just to get to the doorstep of their next great challenge. The knights and soldiers who stood before Antioch were not fresh-faced warriors eager for a glorious siege. They were hardened, yes, but also profoundly weakened, already intimately acquainted with death in its most squalid forms. They had seen their comrades waste away, felt the pangs of starvation that gnawed at their own bellies, and faced the terror of a well-supplied enemy when they themselves had next to nothing. The journey had been a brutal filter, stripping away the weak, the unlucky, and the unprepared. This preview of pain had set an appallingly low bar. They had endured what many would consider the worst possible conditions a medieval army could face. They had been pushed to the very limits of human endurance, and then some. Surely, they must have thought, as they gazed upon the formidable defenses of Antioch, that things couldn't get any worse than what they had already been through on that hellish march across Anatolia. They thought that was bad? Bless their naive, starving, half-dead little hearts. They had absolutely no idea what fresh, inventive, and truly monumental levels of suckage were waiting for them just beyond those imposing stone walls. The overture of suffering was over. The grand opera of agony was about to begin. So, our battered, half-starved, and thoroughly miserable army of crusaders finally limps its way to the outskirts of Antioch in late October 1097. After the horrors of the Anatolian march, you might think they'd earned a bit of a breather, a slightly less soul-crushing challenge. Well, Antioch was waiting, and it wasn't in a cooperative mood. As they crested the hills and laid eyes on their objective, any fleeting sense of relief probably curdled into a potent cocktail of awe and sheer bowel-loosening dread. This was no mere town. This was a legend carved in stone, and it looked positively, stubbornly, terrifyingly huge. Antioch wasn't just some upstart fortress. It was an ancient metropolis, a city that had seen empires rise and fall. Once a jewel of the Roman and Byzantine empires, a cradle of early Christianity where believers were first called Christians, it was steeped in history. But history, however venerable, doesn't stop arrows or feed starving besiegers. Now, it stood as a formidable bastion of Seljuk Turkish power in Syria, a strategic linchpin that absolutely had to be taken if the crusade was to have any hope of reaching Jerusalem. The city seemed to stare back at them, unimpressed. The sheer physical scale of Antioch was the first punch to the gut. This wasn't a castle you could neatly surround with a few thousand men. The city sprawled across a vast area, nestled between the Orontes River on one side and the imposing slopes of Mount Storin and Mount Silpius on the other. Its defensive perimeter stretched for miles, a daunting expanse that would require an immense force to even loosely contain, let alone effectively assault. For the already depleted Crusader army, it was a sobering sight. Many a knight probably gulped, their earlier bravado momentarily deserting them. And then there were the walls. Oh, those magnificent, infuriating walls. Largely the work of centuries of Roman and Byzantine engineering, most famously attributed to emperors like Justinian and Theodosius II. These were no hastily erected palisades. We're talking massive curtains of solid stone, reputedly up to 60 feet high in places, and thick enough to make a mockery of any light siege equipment the Crusaders might have dragged with them. These were walls built to endure, to withstand earthquakes, invasions, and the petty ambitions of would-be conquerors. They practically radiated an aura of, "Don't even try it." As if the height and thickness weren't enough, these colossal walls were punctuated by an obscene number of defensive towers. Contemporary accounts and later estimates suggest somewhere in the realm of 400 to 450 of them. 400 towers! Each one was a potential firing platform, a strong point from which archers and crossbowmen could rain down death upon anyone foolish enough to approach. They studded the entire length of the fortifications, ensuring no section of the wall was without overlapping fields of fire. It was a porcupine of a city. Looming over the eastern part of the city, casting a long shadow of nope, was the citadel. Perched atop Mount Starin, or Mount Silpius as it's also known, this was Antioch's ultimate strongpoint, its defiant keep. Roughly 1,000 feet above the main city, it possessed its own formidable walls and commanded a breathtaking view of any approaching enemy, and an even more breathtaking position from which to drop unpleasant things on their heads. Even if the Crusaders managed the nigh impossible task of breaching the city walls, the citadel promised a whole new world of pain. Nature itself seemed to conspire in Antioch's defense. The swift-flowing Orontes River protected its western flank, making a direct assault from that direction incredibly hazardous. Ravines and rugged, broken terrain further complicated any approach on other sides, channeling attackers into predictable, vulnerable paths. It was as if the land itself had been sculpted to cradle and protect this ancient stronghold, making the job of any besieger an absolute nightmare before they even got within bowshot of the main defenses. And who was manning these formidable defenses? Not a token force, that's for sure. The city was under the command of Yaghi, an experienced Seljuk governor appointed by Ridwan of Aleppo. He had a substantial garrison of professional soldiers, likely numbering several thousand, bolstered by the city's militia. These weren't green recruits. They were motivated defenders, fighting for their homes, their faith, and their lives, from behind some of the most impressive fortifications in the known world. They were also, crucially, reasonably well stocked, at least at the outset. Yaghi was no fool. Anticipating the Crusaders' arrival, he had taken precautions, including expelling many of the local Greek Orthodox and Armenian Christians from the city, fearing they might sympathize with the attackers. This shrewd, if harsh, move consolidated his control and removed a potential fifth column. The garrison was ready, vigilant, and undoubtedly aware of the Crusaders' reputation. They were not about to roll over and play dead. They were prepared for a long, hard fight. So what was the Crusaders' grand strategy for tackling this behemoth? Well, that's where things get a bit murky. It seems that, despite their recent harrowing experiences in Anatolia, a certain degree of campaign-earning optimism, or perhaps sheer desperation, still lingered. They were God's army, after all. Surely these walls, however imposing, would crumble before their righteous zeal. This initial assessment, if one could even call it that, woefully underestimated the task ahead. They were about to learn a very hard lesson in medieval siegecraft, or rather, the lack thereof. One glaring problem was their almost complete absence of proper siege equipment. Heavy trebuchets, mangonels, substantial battering rams, siege towers, the kind of hardware you actually need to make a dent in Theodosian-era walls, were conspicuously missing. They had hoped for Byzantine assistance with such specialized gear, but that hadn't materialized in any significant way. The idea of building these complex machines on site with limited timber resources and even more limited engineering expertise was a daunting prospect. This lack of expertise was another critical failing. The Crusader army was primarily composed of knights and infantry geared for open-field battles, not the patient, methodical, and highly technical business of reducing a major fortress. Siege warfare was a specialized art, requiring engineers, miners, and a level of coordinated drudgery that didn't quite fit the chivalric ideal of a glorious charge. Our knights were, by and large, woefully unprepared for the gritty, unglamorous reality of a prolonged siege against such a target. Furthermore, the sheer size of Antioch made a complete hermetic encirclement almost impossible for the Crusader army at its current strength. To effectively seal off all gates and prevent any supplies or reinforcements from reaching the city required more men than they could effectively deploy around such a vast perimeter. For months, key gates, like the bridge gate, remained relatively open, allowing some communication and resupply for Yaghi's forces, while the Crusaders themselves were spread thin and vulnerable. So, to call what initially transpired a siege is perhaps a generous overstatement. It was less an active, pressing assault and more a slow, painful, and often ineffective blockade. The Crusaders set up separate camps around different sections of the walls, Bohemond here, Raymond there, Godfrey somewhere else, but they couldn't stop every donkey train, nor could they prevent daring sorties by the garrison, which frequently harassed their foraging parties and attacked isolated contingents. Their own camps soon became sprawling, unsanitary cities of misery, exposed to the elements and the enemy. Disease, their old friend from the Anatolian march, found fertile ground. Supplies, as always, were a constant source of anxiety. While the defenders within Antioch initially had food and water, the besiegers outside were often struggling, looking out at fertile lands they couldn't always safely access. The irony was as bitter as the winter winds that would soon sweep through their ragged tents. The daunting reality began to sink in. Antioch wasn't going to fall in a week or even a month to a few brave charges or a conveniently crumbling wall. This was a different kind of warfare, a grinding test of endurance, logistics, and willpower. The uncooperative fortress of Antioch loomed before them, a silent, stony testament to their unpreparedness and a harbinger of immense suffering to come. This, our knights slowly realized, was going to suck on an entirely new, monumental scale. So, our Crusader knights have stared down the mighty, uncooperative walls of Antioch. They've realized this isn't going to be a quick smash and grab. The initial enthusiasm, already battered by the march from hell, now faces its most insidious, relentless, and ultimately defining opponent of the entire siege. Starvation. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first and arguably most brutal Hunger Games of the Crusades, where your average knight is the unwilling star contestant and the grand prize is simply not dying today. As autumn 1097 bled into a wet, miserable winter, the already meager supplies the Crusaders had scrounged or brought with them began to vanish at an alarming rate. The surrounding countryside, initially a source of some provisions, was quickly stripped bare by thousands of hungry mouths, or made lethally dangerous by Turkish patrols. Foraging became less a supply run and more a deadly gamble. The great creaking machinery of the Crusader army, which ran on food, started to grind to a terrifying halt. The gnawing in their bellies was just the overture. For many a nobleman, a knight raised on hearty feasts and the choicest cuts, this was likely their first true encounter with profound, inescapable hunger. Imagine going from venison and fine wine to the desperate hope of finding a single, perhaps slightly moldy grain of wheat. The psychological shock, the sheer indignity of it for men of their station, must have been as debilitating as the physical weakness. This wasn't a temporary fast. This was a descent into a new, terrifying reality where social standing meant nothing to an empty stomach. Foraging expeditions, once hopeful ventures, became increasingly desperate and perilous missions deep into hostile territory. Bands of knights and soldiers would ride out not in search of glory but of anything remotely edible, a forgotten cache of grain, a lonely goat, even roots and unappetizing weeds. More often than not, they returned with little or not at all, having fallen victim to Turkish ambushes or the myriad dangers of a war-torn, starving land. Each failed foray tightened the noose of famine around the Crusader camp. The first, and perhaps most heartbreaking, casualties of the dinner plate were the horses. A knight's warhorse was his partner, his status symbol, his key to battlefield prowess. To willingly slaughter and eat such a creature was an act of supreme desperation, yet as the weeks turned into months, the neighs in the Crusader camp grew fainter, replaced by the grim sounds of butchery and the sizzle of horseflesh over dwindling fire. Each consumed steed was another blow to their military capability and their morale. Once the horses were gone, the definition of food took a sharp, horrifying nosedive. Faithful hunting dogs, companions in sport and war, started looking less like friends and more like protein. Cats, if any were foolish enough to be around, vanished. Then came the rats and mice, creatures of the filth now pursued with a hunter's zeal. The chronicles paint a grim picture. Knights, once proud and disdainful, now squabbling over a scrawny rodent or a handful of withered grubs. When the last rat was a distant memory, the truly unsavory alternatives came into play. Shoe leather, shields, and old hides were boiled for hours in the desperate hope of extracting some minuscule nutritional value. Tough grasses, thistles, and tree bark became menu items. They sifted through animal dung for undigested grains of barley. The knights, champions of Christendom, were reduced to grazing like starving cattle, their once mighty frames growing gaunt and hollow-eyed. Every waking moment became a relentless, agonizing search for calories, any calories. A balanced diet during the Siege of Antioch, well, that was a grim joke, perhaps only if you counted the various shades of mold growing on scavenged scraps as a distinct food group. Or maybe if balanced meant teetering precariously on the very edge of starvation, where every morsel, no matter how vile or rotten, was a gift from a seemingly absent god, the concept of palatable food was a distant, luxurious dream. Survival was the only dish on offer, and it tasted like despair. Inevitably, in such dire circumstances, the ugliest aspects of human nature began to surface. Anyone fortunate enough to have a secret stash of food or the money to buy it from a rare, opportunistic sutler guarded it with their life. Prices for even the meanest scraps skyrocketed. A handful of beans could cost a king's ransom. The gap between the haves and the have-nots became a chasm, with the vast majority of common soldiers and poorer knights slipping deeper into the abyss of starvation, watching as a privileged few managed to cling to a slightly less wretched existence. The physical toll was horrific. Men wasted away, their muscles atrophying, their skin stretching tight over jutting bones. The once strong arms that wielded swords could barely lift them. Malnutrition invited disease, and the already rampant sicknesses in the camp found easy victims among the emaciated. Knights collapsed on sentry duty, their bodies simply giving out. The camp became a landscape of walking skeletons, a testament to the slow, agonizing power of famine. Beyond the physical decay was the crushing psychological impact. Hope dwindled with each sunrise that brought no relief. Apathy settled over the camp like a chilling fog. Men who had marched thousands of miles, burning with religious zeal, now stared blankly, the spark in their eyes extinguished by chronic hunger. The constant gnawing emptiness in their stomachs hollowed out their spirits, leaving behind a despair so profound it was almost tangible. The crusade for Jerusalem was, for many, reduced to a crusade for the next mouthful, and with despair came moral degradation. The bonds of camaraderie, the codes of chivalry, began to fray under the relentless pressure of starvation. Theft of food became common, leading to brutal reprisals. Discipline crumbled. Men, driven mad by hunger, would fight over a discarded bone or a suspect root. Self-preservation, that most basic instinct, overrode oaths of brotherhood and loyalty. The noble quest was being systematically stripped of its nobility by the simple, brutal absence of bread. Among the starving masses, a particularly feared and grim group emerged, the Tafurs. These were the poorest of the poor, crusaders, driven to an almost feral state by their suffering. Clad in rags, armed with crude weapons, and reportedly led by a king Tafur, they became a lawless, desperate band. Dark rumors swirled around them, whispers of cannibalism, that they would fall upon the bodies of slain enemies and perhaps even their own dead, to sate their horrific hunger. The knightly leaders were often horrified, yet sometimes turned a blind eye, for the Tafra's savage ferocity in battle was also a terrifying asset. The very notion of eating human flesh, once unthinkable, now haunted the starving camp. While the most documented instances of Crusader cannibalism, primarily of fallen enemy combatants, occurred later at Ma'arat al-Numan, the extreme conditions at Antioch undoubtedly pushed men to the brink. Chronicles hint at unspeakable acts, born of ultimate desperation. Whether it was enemy dead, or as the prompt horrifically suggests, their own dead, the fact that such thoughts could even be entertained, let alone whispered about, shows the utter breakdown of human norms under the tyranny of starvation. It was the lowest circle of this particular hell. The leaders of the crusade, Bohemond, Raymond, Godfrey, watched this slow-momentum catastrophe unfold with growing alarm. They organized increasingly risky foraging expeditions, pleaded for supplies from any potential source, and tried to maintain some semblance of order and military readiness. But how do you command an army that is literally eating itself and its surroundings to survive? How do you inspire men whose only thought is the agonizing emptiness in their bellies? Their leadership was tested as never before, not by enemy swords, but by the silent siege from within. Ultimately, for the average knight at Antioch, hunger became the defining feature of his existence, the true, omnipresent enemy. It stripped away his strength, his dignity, his morality, and very nearly his humanity. The glorious aspirations of the crusade, the quest for Jerusalem, the honor of knighthood, all were overshadowed by the primal, all-consuming need for food. This, more than any enemy attack or botched strategy, is what made it truly profoundly suck to be a knight at the Siege of Antioch. It was the ultimate agonizing hunger game. So our crusading knights are already intimately familiar with starvation and the soul-crushing sight of Antioch's impenetrable walls. But just when they thought things couldn't get any more delightfully dreadful, another insidious enemy began to creep through their ranks, an unseen killer that cared not for rank, piety, or skill with a sword. I speak, of course, of disease. Rampant, relentless, and responsible for turning the Crusader camp into a festering petri dish of medieval maladies. If you thought starvation was bad, wait till you hear about the plumbing, or lack thereof. The Crusader camp outside Antioch was, to put it mildly, not a health spa. Tens of thousands of soldiers, pilgrims, and camp followers were crammed together in a sprawling, makeshift city of tents and hovels. For months on end, this dense mass of humanity ate, slept, and, well, performed all their bodily functions in close proximity. Add torrential winter rains, which turned the ground into a muddy quagmire, and you have the perfect five-star resort for every germ known to the 11th century. It was less a military encampment and more a biohazard waiting to happen. Sanitation, as we understand it, was a concept reserved for some distant, more enlightened future. Where did all the human waste go? Mostly into hastily dug latrine pits, often too close to living quarters, or, disastrously, water sources. Flies, the buzzing little messengers of misery, swarmed everywhere, happily commuting between the latrines and the meager food supplies. Personal hygiene for the average crusader, knight or peasant, likely consisted of a splash of water if they were lucky and a whole lot of hope. It was a recipe for disaster, seasoned with ignorance. And the water, oh, the water. While the Orontes River flowed nearby, it also served as a convenient dumping ground for all sorts of refuse from both the city and the Crusader camp itself. Wells could easily become contaminated, and in a desperate, thirsty army, any puddle might start to look appealing after a while. Little did they know that each gulp could be an invitation to a host of waterborne pathogens eager to set up shop in their already weakened intestines. It was a game of medieval Russian roulette every time they took a drink. First on our hit parade of horrible ailments was dysentery, affectionately known in less polite circles as the bloody flux. This particularly nasty intestinal inflammation caused agonizing cramps, fever, and a relentless bloody diarrhea that could drain a strong man of his life fluids in a matter of days. Knights, who once sat proudly on their war horses, now found themselves queuing for the overflowing latrine pits. Their bodies racked with pain and shame, it was a profoundly undignified way to go, a world away from a glorious death on the battlefield. Then there was camp fever, a lovely catch-all term that likely included typhoid and typhus. Typho, spread by contaminated food and water, brought on high fevers, delirium, severe abdominal pain, and a characteristic rash. Typhus, often transmitted by lice, of which there was no shortage in the Crusader camp, had similar debilitating symptoms. These fevers would burn through the ranks, leaving men too weak to stand, let alone fight, their bodies consumed from within. The air would have been thick with the groans of the afflicted. But wait, there's more! Scurvy, born from a chronic lack of vitamin C due to the absence of fresh fruits and vegetables in their starvation diet, would have caused teeth to loosen, gums to bleed, and old wounds to reopen. Skin infections from minor scratches to boils and ulcers would have festered in the unsanitary conditions, sometimes leading to deadly sepsis. And with the cold, damp winter, respiratory illnesses, pneumonia, bronchitis, and the common cold on steroids would have run rampant, turning every cough into a potential death sentence. The already horrific effects of starvation played perfectly into the hands of these diseases. Malnourished bodies have severely weakened immune systems. Knights who might have otherwise fought off a minor infection found themselves utterly defenseless. Hunger stripped away their reserves, and disease waltzed in to finish the job. It was a terrifying 1-2 punch, a symbiotic relationship of suffering that ensured the Crusader casualty rates from sickness far outstripped those from actual combat for long stretches of the siege. The sheer numbers of those falling ill were staggering. Chroniclers of the First Crusade speak of pestilence sweeping through the camp, carrying off hundreds, sometimes thousands. At certain points, so many men were sick or dying that the army was practically immobilized. It wasn't just the common soldiers. Knights and nobles were just as vulnerable. The great equalizer, disease, didn't check your pedigree before striking you down with a fever or a gut-wrenching flux. Every tent, from the grandest pavilion to the meanest hovel, became a potential sick ward. Indeed, no amount of wealth or status offered reliable protection. Adhemar of the Puy, the esteemed papal legate, the spiritual leader of the entire crusade, would himself succumb to sickness shortly after Antioch's fall, a testament to how pervasive and indiscriminate these illnesses were. If a man of his importance, presumably with access to the best, or at least ridden conditions and care available, could be struck down, what hope did the average lice-ridden, half-starved knight have? Germs, it turns out, are terribly democratic. And what of medical care in this medieval charnel house? Let's just say it wasn't exactly up to modern standards. Treatments often involved bloodletting, further weakening the already anemic, prayer, undoubtedly fervent but of limited clinical efficacy against bacteria, and various herbal concoctions that might taste awful but do little else. Some physicians might have offered comfort, but true cures were far beyond their grasp. More often than not, a diagnosis of serious illness was simply the beginning of a swift and miserable end. The constant presence of sickness had a devastating psychological impact. Imagine watching your comrades, men you'd fought alongside and shared your last crust of bread with, die not from a clean sword stroke, but from a wasting, stinking illness. The fear of falling ill oneself must have been a constant, gnawing anxiety. Every stomach cramp, every cough, every bead of sweat could be the harbinger of a gruesome demise. The camp wasn't just a place of physical suffering, it was a breeding ground for despair and terror. The stench alone must have been unbearable. The pervasive aroma of unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food, and the sickly sweet smell of decay and death would have hung heavy in the air. It was an olfactory assault that served as a constant reminder of the filth and disease that enveloped them. You couldn't escape it day or night. This was the atmosphere in which knights were supposed to maintain their morale and their will to fight. Good luck with that. Naturally, this rampant disease had a crippling effect on military operations. An army can't fight effectively if a significant portion of its soldiers are too busy expiring from dysentery or burning with fever. Siege duties were neglected, defenses against Turkish sorties weakened, and foraging parties, already dangerous, became missions of near suicide for those weakened by illness. The unseen enemy, disease, was doing more to dismantle the Crusader army than Yagiseyan's garrison could have hoped for. So forget your romantic notions of dying gloriously in a valiant charge against the infidel, a sword in your hand and a prayer on your lips. For far too many knights at the Siege of Antioch, the grim reality was a far more ignoble end. You were statistically more likely to expire, groaning and befouled, on a makeshift latrine pit, or shivering to death in a damp tent, than you were to meet your end in a blaze of battlefield glory. It was the ultimate anti-climax to a holy warrior's career. In the grand, miserable tapestry of the Siege of Antioch, disease was a thick, dark, and ever-present thread. It was the unseen yet horribly visible enemy that stalked every crusader, turning their camp into a charnel house and their dreams of holy conquest into a feverish nightmare. It was a constant, demoralizing, and utterly unglamorous factor that massively contributed to why it truly, profoundly sucked to be a knight in this particular holy endeavor. So our knights are starving, diseased, and staring at a fortress that laughs at their very existence. You'd think, under such dire circumstances, the leaders of the First Crusade would band together, a shining beacon of unity and strategic genius, right? Wrong. So very, hilariously, tragically wrong. Welcome to the next layer of suckage, the absolute circus of squabbling, short-sighted, and self-serving leadership that turned a difficult siege into a masterclass in how not to run a holy war. If you thought the enemy outside was bad, wait till you meet the egos inside. The root of the problem was simple. There was no single supreme military commander. Pope Urban II had appointed Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy as the spiritual leader, a sort of moral compass for the crusade. But when it came to actual battlefield decisions and grand strategy, it was government by committee. And this wasn't just any committee. It was a committee of some of the most powerful, proud, and headstrong alpha nobles in Europe, each with his own army, his own agenda, and his own towering opinion of himself, a recipe for magnificent disaster. Let's meet some of our key players in this medieval reality show. There was Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer from southern Italy, cunning, ambitious, and with his eyes firmly fixed on carving out a principality for himself. Antioch, looking like a particularly juicy prize. Then there was Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, the oldest, wealthiest, and arguably most powerful of the lot. Deeply pious, but also proud, stubborn, and not about to let some upstart Norman dictate terms. Add to this Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, genuinely devout, but also a significant power broker, and a host of other counts and dukes like Tancred, Bohemond's equally ambitious nephew. It was a powder keg of personalities. Bohemond, bless his opportunistic heart, saw Antioch not just as a stepping stone to Jerusalem, but as the main event. From the moment he laid eyes on it, he was scheming how to make it his own. This personal ambition colored his every strategic suggestion and his every interaction with the other leaders. The Holy Sepulchre could wait. Prince Bohemond of Antioch had a nice ring to it, and he wasn't shy about maneuvering everyone else to make it happen, often to the detriment of a unified effort. Raymond of Toulouse, on the other hand, saw himself as the senior statesman of the crusade. He'd brought the largest contingent and was deeply committed to the pilgrimage, at least in principle. However, his immense wealth and pride often put him on a collision course with Bohemond. He wasn't keen on Bohemond's blatant land-grabbing, and their mutual suspicion and animosity became one of the defining and most damaging dynamics of the siege. Their bickering alone could have powered a small trebuchet. Godfrey of Bouillon, often portrayed as one of the more purely motivated leaders, still had his own large army and considerable influence to maintain. While perhaps less overtly grasping than Bohemond, he was no pushover and had to navigate the treacherous currents of the leadership council, trying to mediate at times, and at other times undoubtedly looking out for the interests of his own Lorraine and German contingents. Even piety had its practical limits in this viper's nest. With such a cast of characters, strategic disagreements were not just common, they were the daily bread of the leadership council, when they weren't squabbling over actual bread, that is. Should they attempt a risky direct assault on Antioch's formidable walls, despite their glaring lack of siege engines? Or should they try to establish a complete blockade, a near impossible task given the city's size and their own dwindling numbers? Arguments raged, tempers flared, and precious time was wasted while the men starved and sickened. The Council of Princes, as it was grandly known, often resembled less a coordinated military high command and more a particularly acrimonious medieval debate club where the loudest voice or the most intransigent will often carry the day, regardless of strategic merit. Decisions were made at a glacial pace, if at all. Sometimes, individual leaders would simply go off and do their own thing, frustrated with the inaction or convinced their own plan was superior, further fracturing the already fragile unity of the Crusader army. The seeds of this disunity were sown long before they reached Antioch. The oaths many of them had reluctantly sworn to the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos to return any reconquered imperial territories to him were a constant source of tension. Bohemond, in particular, was actively looking for ways to wiggle out of this inconvenient promise regarding Antioch. This underlying disagreement about the ultimate fate of the city infected their ability to cooperate on how to actually capture it in the first place. The allocation of resources, or what little there were, became another bitter point of contention. If a minor fort was captured nearby, who got to garrison it and claim its meager spoils? When foraging parties did manage to bring back some food, how was it distributed amongst the various contingents, each led by a prince jealous of his own authority and the welfare of his own men? Turns out holy wars are considerably less holy when everyone's eyeing each other's meager rations or, worse, hoarding what they have. This tendency for leaders to prioritize their own interests wasn't new. Earlier in the Crusade, Baldwin of Boulogne had famously detached himself from the main army to carve out his own county of Edessa. While that had its own strategic implications, the mindset it represented, personal gain sometimes trumping the collective goal, persisted. At Antioch, this could manifest as a reluctance to commit troops to a dangerous venture if another leader was perceived to benefit more, or a rush to secure a particular section of the wall or a gate if it looked like it might fall. The departure of Tatikios, the Byzantine representative guiding the Crusaders, in February 1098, perfectly illustrates the internal rot. Bohemond allegedly scared him off by suggesting other leaders were plotting against him. Whether true or not, Tatikios left, taking with him the hope of significant Byzantine siege expertise and supplies. Bohemond promptly used this as an excuse to argue that since the emperor had abandoned them, their oaths regarding Antioch were null and void. Convenient that. For the average knight shivering in his tent, this high-level bickering and maneuvering was more than just an abstract political game. It had direct, deadly consequences. Conflicting orders would come down from different commanders. A much-needed offensive might be delayed for weeks while the princes argued. Resources that could have been used to build siege engines or feed the troops were instead hoarded or squandered due to infighting. It was maddeningly, tragically absurd. This pervasive disunity compounded every other misery the Crusaders faced. A united command might have organized foraging more effectively, or established better camp sanitation, or prosecuted the siege with a clearer, more decisive strategy. Instead, the knights were left feeling like pawns in a complex, cynical game played by their overlords, their suffering amplified by the seemingly callous or incompetent leadership that was supposed to be guiding them to holy victory. The comedy of errors at the top had a very real body count at the bottom. Think of the sheer frustration. You've marched across a continent, survived battles, starvation, and disease, all in the name of God and the liberation of the Holy Land, and now you're watching your leaders squabble like spoiled children over who gets the biggest imaginary slice of a pie they haven't even baked yet. The sense of betrayal, the erosion of faith in the Crusades' leadership must have been a heavy burden for the common soldier to bear, on top of everything else. In the end, the leadership squabbles at Antioch weren't just a sideshow. They were a central act in the tragicomedy of the siege. They prolonged the suffering, cost countless lives, and brought the entire crusade perilously close to complete collapse on multiple occasions. For the knight on the ground, it was yet another reason why this whole enterprise sucked so profoundly. Even if you survived the enemy, the hunger, and the plague, you still had to contend with the very real possibility that your own commanders might just mess it all up. Through sheer pride and pig-headedness, our beleaguered knights and their equally miserable comrades have already endured a hellish march. stared into the stony face of Antioch's unyielding defenses, battled rampant disease, and are currently starring in their very own medieval version of the Hunger Games, with a side dish of leadership squabbles. Just when you thought the suffering couldn't possibly find new and inventive ways to escalate, winter decided to make a dramatic, bone-chilling entrance. And let me tell you, the winter of 107-1098 outside Antioch wasn't just a mild inconvenience. It was a full-blown character in this tragicomedy, specializing in frozen misery and despair. Many of these crusaders, hailing from the more temperate climes of Western Europe, were woefully unprepared for the sheer, brutal reality of Assyrian winter. They might have envisioned sun-baked holy lands, not the penetrating damp, freezing rains and biting winds that swept down from the Anatolian plateau. Their gear, designed more for battle than for enduring prolonged exposure to frigid, wet conditions, offered scant protection. Proper winter clothing? For most, that was a distant, luxurious dream. They were about to get a very cold shoulder from Mother Nature. As late autumn morphed into the heart of winter, the weather took a decidedly vicious turn. We're not talking picturesque snowfalls that make for a nice Christmas card. Think instead of relentless, icy rain that soaked everything and everyone to the bone. Sleet that stung exposed skin like 1,000 angry needles. Heavy frosts that turned the muddy ground as hard as iron in the mornings. In the nearby mountains, snow would have been a common sight, a chilling reminder of the frigid air masses descending upon their wretched encampment. Shelter, or the pathetic excuse for it, became a matter of life and death. Tents, often made of worn fabric, offered little resistance to the driving rain and wind. They leaked, they collapsed, they turned into miserable, muddy swamps inside. Knights might have had slightly better pavilions than the common foot soldier, but better is a very relative term when you're still freezing, damp, and surrounded by starving, sick men. Huddling together for warmth became standard operating procedure, a desperate human shield against the elements. And the clothing, or rather the distinct lack of it for many. While a knight might possess his suit of mail and perhaps a woolen tunic, these were hardly the pinnacle of winter insulation, especially when constantly damp. For the poorer pilgrims and soldiers who had arrived with little more than rags on their backs, the winter was an unmitigated torture. They wrapped themselves in anything they could find, sacks, scraps of hide, their own misery, but the cold seeped into their bones, relentless and unforgiving. Pervasive cold naturally had a devastating impact on health. Frostbite became a common affliction, turning fingers, toes, and noses black and dead. Hypothermia, the silent killer, claimed countless lives as core body temperatures plummeted. And for those already weakened by starvation and riddled with diseases like dysentery or camp fever, the cold was often the final, fatal blow. Their emaciated bodies simply had no reserves left to fight off the chill. The death rate in the Crusader camp soared. If food was scarce before winter, it now became almost non-existent. Foraging expeditions, already perilous, were rendered virtually impossible by the foul weather and the denuded landscape. The ground was either frozen solid or a treacherous bog. Any small animals that hadn't already been eaten were hunkered down. The meager rations the Crusaders had were consumed even faster, as their bodies burned precious calories just trying to stay warm. The gnawing hunger became a constant, icy companion to the cold. The poor animals suffered just as terribly. Horses, already weakened by lack of fodder, succumbed in droves to the cold and starvation. Chronicles suggest that a vast majority of their precious war horses and pack animals perished that winter. This was a catastrophic loss, not just in terms of military capability — a knight without a horse is just a very encumbered target — but also for transport and logistics. Each dead horse was another nail in the coffin of their operational effectiveness. Fuel for fires became as precious as food. The surrounding area had long since been stripped of easily accessible firewood. Men would venture further and further, risking Turkish patrols to gather damp branches or anything that might burn. They dismantled abandoned siege equipment, burned their own broken carts, even reportedly dug up roots. Without adequate fires, there was little chance to dry wet clothes, cook what meager food they had, or find even a moment's respite from the gnawing cold. The Orontes River, which flanked their camp, transformed from a potential water source and obstacle into another instrument of torture. Swollen by winter rains, it could flood parts of the already miserable encampment, turning low-lying areas into stagnant, freezing marshes. Crossing it became even more treacherous. It was a cold, gray, indifferent witness to their suffering, offering no comfort, only more dampness and chill to the already saturated landscape of their despair. Unsurprisingly, morale in the Crusader camp hit rock bottom during that dreadful winter. The relentless combination of freezing cold, gnawing hunger, rampant disease, the sight of Antioch's defiant walls, and the perceived inaction or incompetence of their leaders created a perfect storm of hopelessness. The initial fervor of the crusade felt like a distant, almost ludicrous memory. How could God will them to suffer so terribly, in such squalor, for so little apparent gain? For many, the despair was so profound it began to erode their faith. Was this truly a holy endeavor, or had they been led into a frozen, starving hell by misguided zeal or ambitious lords? Chronicles speak of men openly weeping, cursing their fate, questioning the very purpose of their mission. The spiritual crisis was as acute as the physical one. The light of divine purpose was guttering dangerously low in the icy winds of that terrible winter. It was during this nadir of suffering that desertions, already a problem, became rampant. Men simply could not endure any more. Under the cover of darkness, or during the chaos of a storm, they would slip away from the camp, risking death at the hands of Turkish patrols or from starvation and exposure in the wilderness. Anything seemed preferable to another day in that frozen, disease-ridden, starving hellhole. Even prominent figures were not immune to this despair. Indeed, the crisis was so severe that even Peter the Hermit, one of the initial charismatic preachers of the Crusade, and William the Carpenter, a notable French nobleman, attempted to flee the camp in January 1098. They were caught by Tancred's men and ignominiously brought back, shamed before the army. If figures like these were cracking under the strain, imagine the state of the average anonymous soldier. It was a testament to the sheer unendurable misery that winter had unleashed. The Crusader camp itself transformed into a truly desolate landscape. Picture a vast, muddy, windswept plain, dotted with sagging, sodden tents, the air filled with the sounds of coughing, groaning, and the occasional desperate prayer, the ground littered with the frozen carcasses of animals and, all too often, men. It was a vision of utter desolation, a monument to human suffering on a grand scale. Any romantic notions of chivalry or holy war would have frozen solid and shattered in such an environment. That winter of 109-71098 was, in many ways, the ultimate crucible for the First Crusade. It tested the limits of human endurance, faith, and sanity. It broke many spirits and countless bodies. Those who survived it were hardened, certainly, but also deeply scarred. It underscored in the most brutal fashion imaginable just how profoundly it sucked to be a knight, or anyone else for that matter, trapped outside the walls of Antioch when misery itself decided to put on a very cold, very unwelcome shoulder. We've waded through the muck of starvation, disease, leadership squabbles, and a winter so brutal it could freeze the ambition off a saint. So, what's a poor, suffering knight supposed to do when faced with such an overwhelming buffet of misery at the Siege of Antioch? Fight on with grim determination, pray harder, or just maybe consider the radical notion that the most sensible, perhaps even the most chivalrous act was simply walking away from a really, really bad idea. Welcome to the chapter on Desertion, the ultimate unspoken vote of no confidence in the entire enterprise. Let's be clear, the pressures mounting on these crusaders were beyond what most of us can even imagine. The gnawing, perpetual hunger that reduced proud warriors to shadows of their former selves. The rampant, disgusting diseases that carried off comrades in droves, the biting cold of that first terrible winter, the sight of Antioch's walls, still standing proud and defiant after months of fruitless effort, and of course the endless, ego-driven bickering of their so-called leaders. It was a perfect storm, a relentless assault on body, mind, and spirit. Eventually, for many, there came a breaking point, a moment when the abstract ideals of faith, loyalty to a distant pope, or oaths sworn in sunnier, more hopeful times, were utterly overwhelmed by the raw primal instinct for self-preservation, when every fiber of your being screamed that sticking around was tantamount to a slow, agonizing, and utterly pointless suicide. This wasn't cowardice setting in. For many, it was the last flickering ember of sanity asserting itself in an insane world. And who were these deserters? Were they all just lily-livered cowards, the dregs of the army? Hardly. While undoubtedly many of the poor, ill-equipped pilgrims and foot soldiers were among the first to crack, desertion was an equal opportunity employer. It claimed knights and nobles too, men who had reputations to uphold, lands to return to, and souls they presumably still cared about. The misery outside Antioch was just that democratic and that potent. It could break anyone regardless of their station or initial zeal. Perhaps the most shocking and telling example was the attempted desertion of Peter the Hermit himself in January 1098. Yes, that Peter the Hermit, the fiery preacher who had been instrumental in whipping up popular enthusiasm for the crusade in the first place. If the spiritual heart of the People's Crusade was ready to throw in the towel, what did that say about the conditions? He, along with William, Viscount of Milan, a nobleman known rather unflatteringly as the Carpenter, for his brute strength, tried to sneak away from the camp. Their escape attempt was short-lived. They were spotted, pursued, and ignominiously dragged back by Tancred's Norman soldiers, right into the disapproving presence of Bohemond. Imagine the shame, the humiliation. Peter, the man who had inspired thousands, now a captured deserter, he was forced to swear a new oath, to remain with the army, his reputation in tatters, but his actions sent a powerful, undeniable signal throughout the camp. If even he thought this was a lost cause, then things were truly catastrophically bad. Another prominent figure who famously decided, "Nope, I'm out," was Stephen, Count of Blois. Now, his most notable desertion came a bit later, during the terrifying siege by Kerbogha's forces after the Crusaders had taken the city. But the conditions that led to such high profitable flights of fancy, the utter despair, the seemingly hopeless military situation, the terror of impending doom, were brewing and bubbling throughout the entire Crusader siege. Men with wealth and status, men who had a lot to lose, were looking at the odds and deciding that a strategic retreat, however shameful, was preferable to certain miserable death. From a purely rational, detached perspective, was desertion really so illogical? You're starving, you're sick, you're freezing, your leaders are a bickering mess, and the enemy is well entrenched and occasionally pelting you with rocks and insults. The chances of a glorious victory seem to shrink with each passing day, while the chances of dying an anonymous, wretched death soared. In that context, the desire to simply remove oneself from the equation starts to sound less like treason and more like basic common sense. But how did one actually go about deserting from a medieval army camped in hostile territory? It wasn't like hailing a cab. Most attempts were probably made under the cloak of darkness, individuals or small groups slipping past sentries, trying to melt into the unforgiving landscape. Some might have feigned joining a foraging party and then just kept on going. Others, particularly those with means, might have tried to bribe their way onto any passing ships if they could make it to the distant coast, hoping to find passage to Cyprus or even back to Europe. Of course, the act of desertion was fraught with its own considerable perils. Firstly, there was the immediate danger of simply getting lost in an unfamiliar, hostile land. Without supplies, a lone deserter was an easy target for starvation or exposure, perhaps an even lonelier and quicker death than the one they were fleeing in the camp. The Syrian wilderness was not known for its charitable reception to lost, hungry Franks. Then there was the ever-present threat of capture by the Turks. Yaxian's patrols and various local Turkish or Arab militias were constantly prowling the areas around Antioch. A captured Crusader deserter could expect little mercy. A quick death might be the best outcome. Torture, enslavement, or being used for target practice were all distinct possibilities. Fleeing the frying pan of the Crusader camp often meant jumping directly into a very hot and pointy fire. And what if you were caught by your own side? The consequences could be severe. For a common soldier, it might mean a brutal flogging, branding, or even execution, depending on the mood of the commanders and the perceived threat to discipline. For nobles like Peter the Hermit, public shame and a renewed, heavily scrutinized oath might be the punishment, but their authority and honor were deeply compromised. There was no easy way out, no truly safe option. One wonders about the fate of the truly desperate, those at the absolute bottom of the Crusader social ladder, like the infamous Tafurs. When these near-feral individuals deserted, did they even attempt to make it home? Or did they simply vanish into the lawless margins of the war, becoming bandits, scavengers, or worse? For some, desertion might not have been about returning to civilization, but about embracing a more brutal, solitary form of survival away from the collapsing discipline of the main army. The constant trickle and sometimes flood of desertions had a corrosive effect on the morale of those who remained. Every man who slipped away was a testament to the hopelessness of their situation. It bred suspicion. Who would be next? It thinned the already depleted ranks, making guard duties longer and foraging parties smaller and more vulnerable. It was a visible symptom of the sickness that gripped the crusade, a sickness of despair as much as of the body. The Crusader leaders, for all their own infighting, were acutely aware of the danger desertion posed to their entire enterprise. They instituted patrols, made dire threats against would-be runaways, and made examples of those who were caught. Bohemond's public shaming of Peter the Hermit was a clear message. Yet, at times, one senses even a grudging understanding from some chroniclers for the sheer desperation that drove men to such an extreme. When conditions are beyond human endurance, the rules of duty and honor can start to look very flexible indeed. In the grand scheme of why it sacked to be a knight in the Siege of Antioch, desertion stands out as the ultimate, eloquent expression of that suckage. It was a declaration that the suffering had become intolerable, the leadership untrustworthy, and the entire holy mission a catastrophic, deadly failure for the individual caught within it. Sometimes, it seems, the most sensible option, the only act that made any logical sense in a world gone mad, was to turn your back on the whole damn crusade and try, against all odds, to simply survive. After nearly 8 agonizing months of starvation, disease, freezing cold, leadership squabbles, and the ever-present threat of a Turkish relief army, you might expect the fall of Antioch to involve some grand divine intervention. Perhaps angels descending with flaming swords? Or the walls miraculously crumbling like Jericho? Well, spoiler alert, God mostly sat this one out. Antioch fell not because of a miracle, but because of good old-fashioned human fallibility, greed, and a delightfully disgruntled guard with a grudge. Who needs divine help when you've got a traitor on the inside? By late May 1098, the situation for the Crusaders outside Antioch was beyond desperate. They were starving, their numbers decimated, their morale in tatters, and to make matters infinitely worse, a massive Muslim relief army under Kerbogha of Mosul was rapidly approaching. If Antioch didn't fall, and fall now, the Crusaders would be caught between the city's walls and Kerbogha's horde, facing certain annihilation. The clock was ticking, and it was making a very ominous sound. It was the ultimate do-or-die moment, emphasis on the die part. To our favorite ambitious Norman, Bohemond of Taranto. While other leaders were perhaps wringing their hands or praying for a miracle, Bohemond was a pragmatist with an eye for the main chance, namely, becoming Prince of Antioch. He knew a direct assault was suicidal, and a prolonged blockade was no longer an option with Kerbogha breathing down their necks. He needed a different kind of miracle, one that came with a key, or perhaps a conveniently unlocked postern gate. He started looking for an inside man. And as luck or shrewd opportunism would have it, he found one. Meet Firuz, an Armenian armor maker or captain of several towers within Antioch's defenses, often identified as the Tower of the Two Sisters. Now, Firuz wasn't some ideologically motivated convert to the Crusader cause. No, his motivations were far more relatable. He reportedly had a serious beef with Antioch's governor, Yaghi. Perhaps Yaghi had overtaxed him, confiscated his property, or publicly insulted his prize-winning goat. Whatever the reason, Firuz was disgruntled, and Bohemond smelled an opportunity. The exact nature of Firuz's grievances is lost to the mists of time and biased chronicles, but it was enough to make him consider betraying his post. Was it purely for a hefty bag of gold promised by Bohemond? Was it revenge? Or perhaps, as some suggest, he was a Christian who had converted to Islam under duress and saw a chance to aid his co-religionists. Most likely it was a messy cocktail of all of the above. What mattered was that he was willing to talk, and Bohemond was all ears, promising him wealth and status. So began the clandestine negotiations. Bohemond, ever the cunning operator, kept these dealings largely secret from the other Crusader princes. He didn't want them messing it up, or, heaven forbid, trying to claim Antioch for themselves if the plan worked. He made Firuz an offer he presumably couldn't refuse. The deal was simple. Firuz would grant a select group of Crusaders access to the towers he commanded. It was a risky, high-stakes gamble for both sides. The plan, hatched in whispered conversations and furtive messages, was audacious. Firuz would lower a ladder from his section of the wall on an agreed-upon night. A small, elite party of Bohemond's men would scale the walls, overpower any nearby guards, and then open one of the city gates from the inside, allowing the main Crusader army to pour in. Simple, right? Except for the part where they had to climb a 60-foot wall in the dead of night, directly above a very alert enemy garrison. The chosen few for this delicate operation numbered around 60 of Bohemond's most trusted knights and soldiers. Imagine their nerves. After months of passive suffering, they were now tasked with an incredibly dangerous, active mission, the success or failure of which rested entirely on their stealth, their courage, and the reliability of one very disgruntled Armenian. One slip, one sneeze, one prematurely crowing rooster, and it would all end in a bloody mess at the foot of the walls. The night of June 2nd, stretching into the early hours of June 3rd, 1098 was the appointed time. Under the cover of darkness, Bohemond's men, hearts undoubtedly pounding like war drums, approached the designated tower. Firuz, true to his word, lowered a leather or rope ladder. The ascent began, a terrifying climb in the pitch black, weighed down by armor and weapons, each rung creaking ominously. One can only imagine the whispered prayers and curses. There were, as with any truly desperate venture, elements of farce. Accounts suggest that at one point the ladder, overloaded with nervous Normans, began to strain or even break, causing a delay and near panic. Some of the men, terrified by the height or the sounds from within the city, hesitated. Firuz himself reportedly grew agitated, urging them on. For a while, the entire fate of the crusade literally hung by a thread, 60 feet above a very hard landing. It was less a heroic assault and more a sweaty-palmed, awkward scramble. But somehow, miraculously, or perhaps just luckily, the first few men made it to the top. They were met by Firuz, and together they managed to overwhelm the unsuspecting guards in that section of the wall. More men scrambled up the ladder. They then fought their way to a nearby gate, some sources say the Gate of St. George or the Gate of the Bridge, and with a collective heave, managed to unbar it from the inside. The path into Antioch was open. The main Crusader army, waiting in hushed, anxious anticipation outside, heard the prearranged signal, a horn blast, a shout, and then the unmistakable sound of a city gate groaning open. That was their cue. With a roar born of months of pent-up frustration, hunger, and fury, they surged forward, a desperate tide of starving, vengeful warriors, finally unleashed upon the sleeping city. What followed was not a clean, surgical capture. It was a bloodbath. The Crusaders, brutalized by months of suffering and driven half-mad by hunger, showed little mercy. They rampaged through the streets, slaughtering anyone they encountered, soldiers, civilians, men, women, and, in the chaos and darkness, even some of the city's native Christians who they were supposedly there to liberate. It was a horrific, indiscriminate release of pent-up savagery. For the average knight, this was payback, served brutally cold. Yagishian, the governor, was caught completely by surprise. Realizing the city was lost, he fled with a small bodyguard, but his luck ran out. He fell from his horse, was abandoned by his retainers, and was eventually found and killed by some Armenian or Syrian woodcutters, who gleefully presented his severed head to the Crusaders. With his death, any organized resistance within Antioch collapsed, leaving the city to the mercy of its new, very angry masters. And so, after nearly 8 long months of unimaginable suckage for the knights outside its walls, Antioch was liberated, or, more accurately, conquered, through treachery and then subjected to a horrific sack. The grand rhetoric of holy war and divine will seemed rather hollow amidst the screams of the dying and the plunder of a city that had been, just hours before, a symbol of their deepest despair. The knights finally had something to eat, even if it was looted from the terrified survivors. But this, dear viewers, was Antioch. And in Antioch, the suckage never truly ends. It merely changes its flavor. The city had fallen not to a brilliant feat of arms, nor a divine miracle, but to a bribe, a grudge, and a rope ladder. And as the Crusaders reveled in their bloody victory, gorging themselves on captured supplies, they were blissfully unaware that their own personal Hunger Games were about to get a sequel. For Kerbogha's massive relief army was now at the gates, and the Besiegers were about to become the Besieged. The irony was almost as thick as the blood in the streets. So, Antioch has fallen. Our Crusader knights, after nearly 8 months of unimaginable suffering, have finally breached the walls thanks to a disgruntled Armenian named Firuz in a conveniently placed ladder. The city is theirs, cue triumphant music, joyous feasting, and perhaps a well-deserved nap, right? Wrong. So incredibly, catastrophically wrong, because this is the Siege of Antioch, where every silver lining has a very large, very angry storm cloud attached. Congratulations, Crusaders. You won. Now prepare to die, but this time from the inside. The initial celebrations inside Antioch were less about joyous feasting and more about a brutal, frenzied sack of the city. Starving men, pushed to the brink of madness, gorged themselves on whatever food they could loot, while others indulged in horrific slaughter and plunder. But this chaotic, bloody revelry was shockingly short-lived. The Crusaders had barely had time to wipe the blood off their swords and count their meager spoils before a new, far more terrifying threat appeared on the horizon. It was the medieval equivalent of a really bad hangover, followed immediately by an alien invasion. Just a few days after Antioch fell into Crusader hands, barely enough time for them to realize what a dilapidated, corpse-strewn, and resource-empty prize they had actually won, the massive relief army of Kerbogha, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul, arrived. And when I say massive, I mean an oh, sweet mother of God, we are well and truly screwed kind of massive. Estimates vary, but suffice it to say, Kerbogha's host vastly outnumbered the exhausted, depleted, and now somewhat bloated Crusader force. The hunter had just become the hunted, with alarming speed. The irony was so thick you could have spread it on a stale piece of lembas bread if they'd had any. For months, the Crusaders had been the ones looking in, desperately trying to breach the walls. Now, in a sickeningly swift reversal of fortune, they found themselves looking out from those same walls, with a determined and vastly superior enemy preparing to seal them in. The very fortifications that had been their torment were now their prison. It was a cosmic joke, and the punchline was looking increasingly fatal. Antioch, the great strategic prize, suddenly felt less like a conquest and more like a colossal, stone-lined trap. The Crusaders had poured all their remaining strength and desperation into capturing it, and now they were stuck inside, surrounded, with nowhere to run and precious little to sustain them. The elation of their treacherous victory evaporated almost instantly, replaced by a cold, hard dread. They had walked right into the lion's den, only to find the lion was much bigger than advertised and had just locked the door behind them. What exactly had they won, anyway? Antioch had just endured an 8-month siege itself. Its granaries were depleted, its infrastructure damaged, its population terrified and hostile. The Crusaders, in their initial rampage, had likely destroyed or consumed much of what little was left. They now had to feed their own starving army from the dregs of an already exhausted city. It was like winning a pie-eating contest where the prize was an empty pie tin and a stomachache. So began Food Situation 2, the revenge of the empty larder. If hunger had been bad for the Crusaders outside the walls, it was about to reach new, even more imaginative levels of awfulness inside. There was no hope of foraging now, not with Kerbogha's army patrolling every approach. Whatever scraps they'd found upon entering the city were quickly devoured. The grim specter of starvation, which had briefly receded, returned with a vengeance, its bony fingers tightening around their throats once more. Adding to their woes, a significant portion of Antioch, the formidable citadel perched on Mount Storum, was still in enemy hands. Shams ad-Dawala, Yagi Sian's son, along with a few hundred loyal defenders, held out in this impregnable fortress within the city. From this vantage point, they could harass the Crusaders below, provide intelligence to Kerbogha, and generally serve as a painful, constant reminder that their conquest was far from complete. It was like having a very angry, very well-armed hornet's nest in your newly acquired living room. Kerbogha, a skilled commander, quickly established a tight blockade. His forces surrounded Antioch, cutting off all avenues of escape or reinforcement. His siege engines began to hurl rocks and abuse at the city walls, a demoralizing taste of their own medicine for the Crusaders. The massive Turkish camp, sprawling across the plains, was a visible testament to their overwhelming numbers and the hopelessness of the Christian position. Every sunrise brought a fresh wave of despair. The psychological warfare was intense. Kerbogha's men would taunt the defenders, promising them slow and painful deaths, or perhaps just parade captured foragers before the walls. The sheer sight of that enormous, confident enemy army, compared to their own dwindling, starving numbers, was a daily assault on Crusader morale. The brief flicker of triumph they'd felt just days before was extinguished, replaced by a suffocating sense of doom. God wills it started to sound like a very bad joke. Morale, predictably, didn't just plummet. It hit the bedrock of despair and started digging. To have come so far, endured so much, achieved what seemed impossible by finally taking the city, only to be immediately trapped and facing annihilation, it was a cruel twist almost beyond human endurance. All the old doubts, the old fears came rushing back, magnified 100-fold. Was this God's will? Or had they been abandoned in this faraway hostile land, their victory a hollow prelude to an even more horrific demise? The leadership, now nominally under Prince Bohemond of Antioch, faced an almost insurmountable crisis. What good was being prince of a city you were about to starve to death in? The old rivalries and tensions, though perhaps temporarily papered over by the shared terror, still simmered. How could they possibly fight their way out against such odds? What miraculous strategy could save them now? Desperate times called for desperate measures, and desperation was rapidly becoming their only remaining resource. It was in this atmosphere of utter hopelessness that desertion once again became a horribly attractive option, even from within their hard-won city. The most infamous case was that of Stephen Count of Bleu, who, along with some other high-ranking nobles, essentially noped out of the impending catastrophe. Depending on the account, he either fled Antioch itself very early in Kerbogha's siege, or had previously deserted the main Crusader column as it approached the city. Regardless, his flight was a devastating blow. He later encountered the Byzantine Emperor Alexios, who was allegedly marching to relieve Antioch, and convinced him the Crusader cause was utterly lost, causing Alexios to turn back his forces. Thanks, Stephen. Real helpful. The discovery of the so-called Holy Lance by a poor Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew around mid-June provided a much-needed, if highly controversial, morale boost for some. This relic, supposedly the lance that pierced Christ's side, was presented as a sign of divine favor, a promise of victory. Many, particularly in Raymond of Toulouse's camp, clung to it as their last hope. Others, including Bohemond and the papal legate Adamaro before his death, were deeply skeptical. Was it a genuine miracle or a conveniently timed piece of religious propaganda born of sheer desperation? The jury is still out, but it gave some knights a reason to keep fighting. For the average knight, however, the overriding sensation was one of being utterly, hopelessly trapped. They were penned within the very walls they had sacrificed so much to conquer, surrounded by a numerically superior and confident enemy, with starvation and disease once again their constant companions. There was no escape, no retreat, and seemingly no hope of rescue. The claustrophobia, the sense of impending doom, must have been suffocating. It was a new dimension of suckage, and so the grand conquest of Antioch had transformed in a matter of days into a desperate struggle for survival. The Crusaders had successfully navigated the frying pan of besieging the city, only to find themselves dumped directly into the roaring fire of being besieged within it by an even more formidable foe. Congratulations, knights, you played yourselves. The suckage had reached truly epic proportions, and the final, bloody act of this particular drama was about to unfold. So, our Crusader knights are well and truly up the proverbial creek without a paddle, a trebuchet, or even a decent sandwich. Trapped inside Antioch, which they just bloodily conquered, they now find themselves besieged by Kerbogha's massive army. Starvation is back with a vengeance, morale has hit rock bottom and is currently tunneling downwards, and the situation looks utterly, irretrievably hopeless. What they needed was a miracle. And as if on cue, or perhaps because someone had a very bright, very desperate idea, a miracle is exactly what they got. Or did they? Nothing motivates a starving army, after all, like a questionable relic in the promise of a glorious, probably imminent death. Let's just reiterate how dire things were. Imagine the scene inside Antioch in mid-June, 1098. Days of intense, renewed starvation have left the Crusaders as gaunt and spectral as the ghosts that surely haunted the city. Disease is rampant. The leadership is at its wits' end. Outside, Kerbogha's forces are tightening the noose, their taunts echoing off the walls. Desertion is rife, and even the most optimistic knight is probably contemplating the nutritional value of his own shield strap. This wasn't just despair, this was despair squared, then set on fire. Enter, stage left, a rather unlikely figure, Peter Bartholomew. He wasn't a renowned knight, nor a high-ranking clergyman. He was a humble peasant pilgrim from Provence, part of Raymond of Toulouse's contingent, and by most accounts, not exactly a man known for his profound wisdom or unwavering credibility. But Peter had something nobody else did. Visions, specifically visions of St. Andrew, the apostle, who, Peter claimed, had some rather urgent news about a very important lost item. According to Peter, St. Andrew, sometimes accompanied by Christ himself, had been appearing to him in dreams and visions for months, even before Antioch fell. The saint, Peter insisted, had revealed a secret of immense significance: the Holy Lance. The very spear that pierced the side of Jesus Christ as he hung on the cross was buried right there in Antioch, specifically within the Cathedral of St. Peter, and St. Andrew was getting rather insistent that the Crusaders dig it up pronto. Convenient, no? Naturally, when Peter Bartholomew first started talking about his visions, the response from the Crusader leadership was, shall we say, less than enthusiastic. The papal legate, Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, a man of considerable learning and a healthy dose of skepticism, was particularly dubious. He knew that there was already a relic claiming to be the Holy Lance in Constantinople. Was St. Andrew really running a franchise of holy relics? Bohemond, ever the pragmatist, probably rolled his eyes so hard he saw his own ambition. However, one very important leader took Peter Bartholomew and his visions very seriously indeed. Raymond, Count of Toulouse. Why Raymond chose to champion this peasant visionary in his dubious claims is a matter of some debate. Was he genuinely convinced by Peter's piety? Was he so desperate for a miracle that he'd grasp at any straw? Or, being a shrewd politician, did he see an opportunity to elevate his own status and the morale of his Provençal troops by being associated with such a potent divine sign? Perhaps a little of all three. With Raymond's powerful backing, a search party was organized. On a hot June day, a group of 12 men, including Peter Bartholomew and Raymond's own chaplain, began digging within the ancient Cathedral of St. Peter. They dug all day, finding nothing but dirt and disappointment. The initial enthusiasm waned. Then, as evening approached, Peter Bartholomew himself, overcome with visionary fervor, or perhaps just knowing where to look, stripped to his shirt, jumped into the pit, and after a few moments of frantic digging and prayer, emerged triumphantly clutching something. What exactly did they find? Well, it wasn't exactly glowing with divine light. It was, by most accounts, an old, rather unremarkable iron spearhead. Was it the Holy Lance? Or was it just a random bit of ancient Roman or Byzantine military hardware that had been lying forgotten under the cathedral floor for centuries? Its appearance alone did little to settle the debate, but in the charged atmosphere of a besieged, starving city, a rusty spearhead could look very miraculous indeed if you wanted it to. The discovery immediately ignited a fierce debate over its authenticity. Bishop Adhemar remained deeply skeptical, pointing to the existing relic in Constantinople and perhaps questioning Peter Bartholomew's character. He reportedly saw it as a dangerous distraction, or worse, a deliberate deception. Bohemond, while likely sharing Adhemar's private doubts, was astute enough to recognize the immense propaganda value of such a find. If the men believed it was the Holy Lance, then for all practical purposes it was the Holy Lance. Modern historians, looking back with the benefit of hindsight and a less desperate need for divine intervention, largely dismiss the discovery as a pious fraud. The timing was just too convenient. Peter Bartholomew's visions intensified just as the Crusader situation became absolutely critical. The discovery itself was made by Peter in a pit he had others dig. After they had found nothing, it had all the hallmarks of a cleverly or perhaps clumsily orchestrated morale booster. But in 1098 Antioch, critical analysis was a luxury few could afford. For the rank-and-file soldiers, the starving knights and footmen who were facing imminent annihilation, the news of the Holy Lance's discovery was like a lightning bolt from heaven. Skepticism was a privilege of the well-fed and the secure. For these desperate men, it was a tangible sign that God had not abandoned them. He had sent them a weapon, a holy relic of unimaginable power, a standard under which they could fight and conquer. A wave of renewed, almost hysterical religious fervor swept through the beleaguered army. The Holy Lance immediately became more than just a piece of old iron. It became a potent symbol, a battle standard imbued with divine power. It was paraded through the Crusader camp, inspiring awe and a renewed sense of purpose. Men who had been dazed from death by starvation suddenly found new strength. The lance was a direct link to Christ's passion, a physical manifestation of God's will, and a promise of victory against seemingly impossible odds. It was exactly what they needed to hear and see. The Crusader leaders, particularly Bohemond and Raymond, despite any private reservations, were quick to exploit this miracle. They used the discovery of the lance to galvanize the troops for what seemed like a suicidally desperate plan. A massed breakout from Antioch to attack Kerbogha's much larger army head-on. The sermons became more fiery, the appeals to divine aid more fervent. The lance would lead them. God was on their side. What did mere numbers matter against such holy power? Suddenly, the choice facing the average knight seemed different. Before, it had been a slow, miserable death by starvation and disease within the walls, or a slightly quicker, equally miserable death at the hands of Kerbogha's forces if they were breached. Now there was a third option, a glorious, divinely sanctioned death, or dare they hope, victory in open battle. For many, exhausted and half-mad with hunger and religious ecstasy, it was an easy choice. A profound psychological shift occurred within the Crusader ranks. Abject despair gave way to a frenzied, almost ecstatic determination. They had been starving, sick, and terrified. Now they were God's chosen warriors again, armed with a relic of unimaginable power. They prepared for battle not with grim resignation, but with a wild, desperate hope. They were going to show Kerbogha what an army on the brink of starvation, armed with a pointy piece of iron and a whole lot of faith, could really do. Whether the Holy Lance of Antioch was a genuine miracle, a clever deception, or simply a case of wishful thinking finding its outlet, its impact was undeniable. It provided the psychological spark that ignited one of the most improbable and desperate battles of the entire Crusades. The stage was now set for a final, bloody confrontation, where starving, half-dead knights, inspired by a highly questionable relic, would attempt to achieve the impossible. The suckage was about to reach its glorious, or perhaps just gory, climax. Our starving, disease-ridden, and thoroughly demoralized Crusader knights are trapped. They've won Antioch, only to be immediately besieged by Kerbogha's colossal army. Hope has not just left the building, it's emigrated to another continent. They are out of food, out of options, and very nearly out of time. So, what's a good Christian knight to do? Well, when you're backed into a corner with nothing but a questionable holy relic and an empty stomach, you do the only logical thing. You try to punch way, way above your weight class in a blaze of desperate, possibly suicidal glory. The decision to sally forth from Antioch and engage Kerbogha's vastly superior forces was born not of strategic genius, but of sheer, unadulterated desperation. The alternative was to sit tight and slowly starve to death, or be overrun when their weakened limbs could no longer hold the walls. As one Crusader leader reportedly put it, "It was better to meet death in glorious battle than to perish like trapped rats. A grim choice, but a choice nonetheless. The Council of Princes, spurred by visions and the supposed power of the Holy Lance, agreed they would fight. In this critical hour, Bohemond of Taranto, now the self-proclaimed Prince of Antioch, pending ratification from the other bickering nobles, rose to the occasion as the overall tactical commander. Whatever his flaws and ambitions, Bohemond was a skilled and experienced soldier. He knew this was a long shot of monumental proportions, but he began to organize their tattered forces for one final, improbable gamble. If they were going down swinging, preferably with a wholly pointy stick leading the charge. Let's be brutally honest about the state of the army Bohemond had to work with. These weren't the proud, well-fed knights who had left Europe years before. These were gaunt, hollow-eyed specters, many weakened by months of starvation and ravaged by dysentery and fever. So many horses had died or been eaten that a significant portion of the knights would be fighting on foot, a severe disadvantage in medieval warfare. They were, quite literally, a ghost army, fueled by little more than religious fervor and the dregs of their depleted courage. Yet there's a strange power in having absolutely nothing left to lose. Bolstered by the discovery of the Holy Lance, which was to be carried into battle as a sacred standard by Raymond of Aguilar, a chaplain of Raymond of Toulouse, an almost hysterical religious ecstasy gripped many of the soldiers. They were on a divine mission, armed with a relic that had touched Christ himself. What were Kerbogha's earthly legions compared to the might of heaven? This potent cocktail of piety and an empty stomach made them dangerously unpredictable. And so, on the morning of June 28, 1098, the die was cast. The gates of Antioch creaked open, not to admit supplies, but to disgorge this ragged army of the faithful. They formed up in several divisions outside the city's bridge gate, a pitifully small force arrayed against the sprawling might of Kerbogha's encampment. To any rational observer, it looked less like a battle formation and more like a suicide pact about to be enacted on a grand scale. The air was thick with prayers, hymns, and the nervous anticipation of impending doom or divine deliverance. What followed was less a carefully executed tactical maneuver and more a medieval version of a Leroy Jenkins charge. With the Holy Lance held aloft, the Crusaders, many barefoot and clad in whatever rags they still possessed, surged forward towards Kerbogha's lines. It was a desperate, frenzied assault, driven by men who knew this was their last chance, their only hope of breaking the iron ring that surrounded them. They charged with the fury of cornered animals, screaming prayers and battle cries. Now Kerbogha was no fool, but he seems to have been massively overconfident, perhaps even contemptuous of this skeletal army emerging from the city he was so certain he had doomed. He had a vast numerical advantage and had been patiently starving them out. Why would they risk everything in such a rash attack? He reportedly allowed the Crusaders to fully deploy outside the walls before engaging, perhaps hoping to crush them all in one decisive blow, or maybe he just couldn't believe his eyes. This overconfidence led to several critical tactical blunders on Kerbogha's part. His forces were somewhat dispersed around the city, and he was slow to concentrate them to meet the unexpected Crusaders' sally. Some accounts suggest he even attempted a feigned retreat with part of his army, hoping to draw the Crusaders into a trap, but this maneuver backfired, sowing confusion among his own troops. He also failed to commit his full strength effectively at the crucial moment, allowing the Crusaders to gain an improbable momentum. The battle, when it was joined, was a chaotic, brutal affair. The starving Crusaders, fighting with the desperate strength of men with nothing to lose, crashed into the astonished Turkish lines. The initial shock of their ferocious, seemingly suicidal attack may have unsettled Kerbogha's troops. For knights reduced to fighting on foot, it was a grim, close-quarters struggle, a whirlwind of hacking swords, stabbing spears, and a whole lot of screaming. And then, according to the deeply pious Crusader chroniclers, the miracles began. As the battle raged, many claimed to have seen celestial reinforcements, radiant figures on white horses, identified as St. George, St. Demetrius, and St. Maurice, leading a ghostly army from the mountains to aid the Christian cause. Was it mass hallucination brought on by starvation, religious ecstasy in the heat of battle, or was it divine intervention? For the men fighting on the ground, it was real enough, and it spurred them on to even greater efforts. Another crucial factor in the unfolding drama was the inherent instability of Kerbogha's coalition army. He was the nominal leader, but many of the emirs under his command were rivals, deeply distrustful of him and each other. When the tide of battle seemed to turn, or when their own particular contingent came under heavy pressure, some of these emirs decided that discretion was the better part of valor and simply withdrew their forces, leaving Kerbogha's line to crumble. So much for Muslim unity against the infidel. And crumble it did. In one of the most astonishing turnarounds in military history, Kerbogha's vast army, beset by internal divisions, tactical errors, and the sheer fanatical onslaught of the Crusaders, broke and fled. Panic spread like wildfire through their ranks. What had seemed like an assured victory for Kerbogha dissolved into a chaotic rout. His great host disintegrated, melting away across the plains, pursued, though not very far, given their exhaustion, by the incredulous Crusaders. The victory was stunning, almost unbelievable. The Crusaders, too weak and depleted to mount a proper pursuit, instead turned their attention to Kerbogha's lavishly supplied camp. And what a sight it must have been! Food, wine, silks, gold, weapons, a treasure trove beyond their wildest dreams. After months of agonizing hunger, they fell upon the provisions like starved wolves. For a brief, glorious moment there was plenty to eat. The immediate threat had been lifted. With Kerbogha's army shattered, the last pocket of resistance within Antioch, the citadel still held by Shams ad-Dawla, finally surrendered, seeing no hope of relief. Bohemond, his gamble having paid off spectacularly, could now more firmly assert his claim as Prince of Antioch. The city was, at long last, fully in Crusader hands, their improbable victory seemingly snatched from the very jaws of annihilation. They had done it, they had survived. But let's not get carried away with the happily ever after. This was an incredible, almost miraculous victory, yes, born of unimaginable desperation, questionable relics, enemy blunders, and a potent dose of religious fanaticism. Antioch was secured for now, but the Crusader army was still a wreck. They were still deep in hostile territory. Jerusalem was still a very long, very dangerous way off. And the fundamental reasons why it sucked to be a knight at Antioch? Well, many of those were about to get a fresh coat of paint for the next leg of the journey. The victory was sweet, but the sort-of part was about to become very apparent. And so, we draw the blood-stained, mud-caked, and thoroughly unhygienic curtains on our exploration of why it truly profoundly sucked to be a knight at the Siege of Antioch. We've trudged through the unforgiving Anatolian plains, shivered through a brutal winter, starved alongside our hapless heroes, navigated the treacherous currents of leadership squabbles, and even squinted at a rather convenient holy relic. If there's one thing to take away from this whole sorry saga, it's that the Siege of Antioch was far less a glorious testament to divine will, and much more a gruesome masterclass in human endurance, raw desperation, and spectacularly questionable hygiene. For the knights who somehow managed to survive this ordeal, Antioch wasn't a shining trophy of Christendom, it was a purgatorial experience etched into their very bones. They emerged not as conquering heroes exuding valor, but as scarred, emaciated figures, haunted by the things they'd seen, the things they'd done, and the comrades they'd lost to battle, famine, and the relentless, unseen enemy of disease. You can bet more than a few of them lay awake at night, staring into the darkness, questioning every single life choice, every sermon, every promise of glory that had led them to that stinking, bloody city on the Orontes. They won, didn't they? The Crusader banners eventually flew over Antioch's battered walls. Kerbogha's massive army was sent packing in a victory that bordered on the absurdly improbable. But at what a staggering price to their bodies, their minds, and perhaps even their souls? How many returned home as mere shadows of their former selves, forever changed by the relentless horrors they had endured? Victory, in this context, feels like a hollow word echoing in the empty bellies and haunted memories of its supposed beneficiaries. The triumph was undeniable, but the taste was unimaginably bitter. The grand narratives of the First Crusade often focus on the strategic maneuvers, the clash of civilizations, the piety of its leaders, but as we've seen for the knight on the ground, the reality of Antioch was far grittier, far more personal, and far less glamorous. It was about the searing pain of an empty stomach, the terror of a feverish night, the misery of a sodden tent in a freezing winter, and the quiet despair of watching your friends and your own ideals waste away. The true story of Antioch is written in those individual agonies. So, as you, our dedicated connoisseur of historical suffering, perhaps prepare to drift off to sleep or maybe just stare into the void, contemplating the miseries of the past, take a moment. Remember those victors of Antioch. Picture them, not in shining armor, but huddled in rags, gnawing on the last stringy bits of horseflesh, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. See them praying desperately, sometimes for rain to break a drought, other times for the incessant, chilling rains of winter to finally cease, and always hoping that the newly discovered holy relics weren't just some very old, very rusty bits of scrap metal. May your own challenges, dear listener, be far less existential than deciding whether to eat your own boots or desert your holy oath. May your food supply be mercifully consistent, your shelter warm and dry, and your water sources untainted by the refuse of a medieval army camp. When you feel a chill, May it be from an overzealous air conditioner, not the icy grip of a Syrian winter with no hope of firewood, and may any miracles in your life be slightly more verifiable than a conveniently discovered spearhead. We hope this journey into the absurd depths of medieval despair, this exploration of why it truly sucked to be a knight at Antioch, has tickled your dark funny bone, or at the very least made you appreciate your comfortable, flush-lettered existence just a little bit more. The past can be a brutal, stinking, and deeply unpleasant place, but its stories, even the most miserable ones, have a strange power to connect us across the centuries, united by the shared, albeit vicarious, experience of human suffering. Thank you for listening with us tonight, for peering into this particularly wretched corner of history. May your dreams be entirely free from the lingering stench of a medieval siege camp, the cries of the starving, and the unsettling feeling that your leadership might just be making it all up as they go along. Sleep well, and remember, however bad things get, at least you're probably not at the Siege of Antioch. Good night.